600,000 men marched into Russia in September 1812. Only 30,000 came back alive. This catastrophe was ordered by a man who had never lost a major battle, who had defeated every army in Europe, who believed himself chosen by destiny. Tonight we uncover how Napoleon Bonaparte's impossible rise to power contained the seeds of his inevitable destruction, and why the man who conquered Europe could never conquer himself. But before we begin this extraordinary journey through the life of history's most controversial genius, I want to hear from you. Take a moment to let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. What country, what state or province. I love connecting with viewers from around the world, and it's fascinating to see how Napoleon's story resonates across different cultures and continents. Also, if you enjoy tonight's deep dive into the mind of the man who almost ruled Europe, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more historical sleep stories. Your support helps me continue bringing these forgotten tales to life. Now, get comfortable, maybe adjust your pillow, turn down the lights, and as you relax into the soothing sounds of the crackling fire, let me tell you the tragic story of ambition without limits, the rise and fall of Napoleon Bonaparte. August 15th, 1769. Ajaccio, Corsica. In a modest stone house overlooking the Mediterranean, a child is born who will one day make the entire continent tremble. But on this sweltering summer day, as his mother Letizia struggles through a difficult labour, there is nothing to suggest that this baby will become the most powerful man in Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte enters the world as a subject not of France, but of the Republic of Genoa. Corsica, that rugged island of granite peaks and ancient vendettas, had been sold to France just a year before his birth, a transaction that would prove to be one of history's most consequential real estate deals. The boy who would one day crown himself Emperor of the French was born, technically, as a foreigner to the empire he would rule. His father, Charles Bonaparte, note the Italian spelling that Napoleon would later abandon, was a minor nobleman struggling to maintain his family's dignity in a world that offered few opportunities for ambitious Corsicans. Charles was intelligent, but impractical, a dreamer who spent more time pursuing grand schemes than attending to his family's modest wine business. He possessed the kind of restless energy that would mark all his children, but lacked the focus to channel it effectively. Letizia Ramolino Bonaparte was carved from different stone entirely, beautiful, strong-willed, and fiercely protective of her children. She would bear Charles 13 children, 8 of whom survived to adulthood. Letizia understood that survival in 18th century Corsica required more than noble blood. It required cunning, determination, and the ability to recognize opportunity when it presented itself. "My children will rise in the world," she would tell her neighbors, "or they will die trying. There is no middle ground for a Bonaparte." The Corsica of Napoleon's childhood was a land caught between worlds. The island had been conquered repeatedly throughout its history by Romans, Vandals, Moors, Pisans, and Genoese. Each conquest had left its mark, creating a people who were proud, suspicious of outsiders, and quick to resort to violence to settle disputes. Honor was everything. Compromise was weakness. The landscape itself seemed designed to forge character. Corsica's mountains rose directly from the sea, creating a terrain so rugged that villages could remain isolated for generations. The maquis, dense brush that covered much of the island, provided perfect cover for bandits and rebels who preferred death to submission. This was a land where vendetta could span generations and where a man's word was his most valuable possession. Into this harsh environment, Napoleon was born, the second surviving son in a family that would eventually include 4 boys and 4 girls. From his earliest years, he displayed the intensity that would mark his entire life. Where other children played, Napoleon studied. Where they accepted, he questioned. Where they followed, he led. His older brother Joseph was gentle and studious. Content to read books and avoid conflict, Napoleon was the opposite. Restless, argumentative, and fascinated by stories of great conquerors. Even as a young child, he would organize his siblings and neighborhood children into mock armies, conducting elaborate campaigns in the olive groves behind their house. He is always thinking, Letizia observed her husband when Napoleon was barely 7 years old. Even when he sleeps, I can see his mind working behind his eyelids. This one will not be content with the quiet life. Napoleon's first education came from his uncle Archdeacon Lucien, a learned priest who recognized unusual intelligence in his nephew. Under Lucien's guidance, Napoleon learned to read and write French, the language of power in his newly French homeland, while maintaining his fluency in the Corsican dialect that was his mother tongue. But it was the stories of ancient heroes that truly captured Napoleon's imagination. He devoured accounts of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Charlemagne, with an intensity that worried his family. These were not mere tales to him. They were instruction manuals for greatness. Why did Alexander weep when he had no more worlds to conquer? 9-year-old Napoleon asked his uncle one afternoon as they walked through Ajaccio's narrow streets. Perhaps because he had confused conquest with achievement, Lucien replied carefully. True greatness comes from building, not destroying. Napoleon considered this answer with the seriousness of a philosopher. But you must destroy the old before you can build the new. Alexander destroyed the Persian Empire so that Greek civilization could spread. Caesar destroyed the Republic so that Rome could become an empire. Destruction is just the first step in creation. This conversation, recorded in Lucien's private journal, reveals the mindset that would drive Napoleon throughout his life. Even as a child, he understood that greatness required the willingness to break things, institutions, traditions, lives, in service of a larger vision. The turning point in Napoleon's childhood came when his father succeeded in securing French scholarships for his 2 oldest sons. Joseph would attend the seminary at Autun, while Napoleon would enter the military academy at Brienne. For a family of modest means, these scholarships represented extraordinary opportunities, but they also meant separation from the island that had shaped the boys' earliest years. Charles Bonaparte's ability to secure these positions revealed his greatest talent, the capacity to recognize which way the wind was blowing and position himself accordingly. When Corsica was sold to France, Charles quickly aligned himself with the new regime. Despite having previously supported Corsican independence, he understood that his children's futures lay not with the past, but with the emerging opportunities that French citizenship might provide. "We are French now," he told his family, as preparations were made for the boys' departure. "Not by choice, perhaps, but by destiny. Our children must learn to succeed in this new world, or they will be crushed by it." Letizia was less enthusiastic about sending her sons away, but she recognized the practical necessity. Corsica offered no paths to advancement for ambitious young men. France, despite its unfamiliarity, represented possibility. On a cold December morning in 1778, 9-year-old Napoleon said goodbye to the island of his birth. He would return to Corsica several times in his youth, but he would never again call it home. The boy who boarded the ship at Ajaccio harbour was still Napoleon Bonaparte, proud Corsican. The man who would emerge from his French education would be Napoleon Bonaparte, citizen of France and citizen of the world. As the ship pulled away from shore, Napoleon stood at the rail watching Corsica's rugged coastline recede into the distance. He did not cry, though he was leaving behind everything familiar. Instead, he memorized every detail of the view, filing it away in the prodigious memory that would serve him throughout his life. "I will be back," he whispered to the wind, "and when I return, it will be as a conqueror." He had no way of knowing that his prophecy would prove true, or that his eventual return to Corsica would be not as a son coming home, but as the Emperor of France, inspecting a distant province of his empire. The Royal Military School at Brienne-le-Château was designed to transform the sons of French nobility into officers capable of serving the Bourbon monarchy with unquestioning loyalty. For most of its students, it was a finishing school that polished existing advantages while instilling the values of aristocratic privilege. For Napoleon Bonaparte, it would prove to be something entirely different, a crucible that would forge the character of a future emperor, while filling him with contempt for the very system it was meant to serve. Napoleon arrived at Brienne in January 1779, a 10-year-old boy whose French was heavily accented with Corsican inflections and whose surname marked him as an outsider in an institution dominated by the sons of ancient French families. He was smaller than most of his classmates, darker in complexion, and possessed of an intensity that made them uncomfortable. From his first day, he was marked as different. The hazing began immediately. His fellow students mocked his accent, his origins, and his family's modest circumstances. They called him the Little Corsican and made jokes about his island's recent sale to France. For a proud boy raised on stories of Corsican resistance to foreign domination, these taunts cut deep. But Napoleon's response to persecution revealed the character that would define his entire life. Rather than retreating into wounded silence or attempting to win acceptance through submission, he chose defiance. When older students tried to bully him, he fought back with a ferocity that surprised them. When they mocked his accent, he began speaking with exaggerated precision, making their French sound crude by comparison. When they questioned his nobility, he recited his family's genealogy with the confidence of a born aristocrat. "He is like a young wolf among sheep," observed Father Patreau, one of the more perceptive instructors. "The sheep may outnumber him, but they fear him nonetheless." Napoleon's academic performance at Brienne was extraordinary, particularly in mathematics and history. He devoured books with the same intensity he brought to everything else, reading not for entertainment, but for instruction. The school's library became his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the social pressures of dormitory life while feeding his voracious intellectual appetite. His favorite subjects were military history and geography. He memorized the campaigns of great generals, studied maps until he could sketch them from memory, and began developing the strategic thinking that would later revolutionize European warfare. Even as a young teenager, Napoleon understood that knowledge was power, and that superior preparation could overcome superior numbers. His mathematics instructor, Professor Dupuy, recognized Napoleon's exceptional abilities and began giving him advanced problems that challenged even graduate students. "This boy possesses a mind like a precision instrument," Dupuy wrote to a colleague. "His capacity for calculation is matched only by his ability to visualize complex spatial relationships. He thinks like an engineer, but with the imagination of an artist." But it was Napoleon's relationship with history that truly set him apart from his classmates. While they memorized dates and names to pass examinations, he studied the past to understand the principles that governed human affairs. He was particularly fascinated by the rise and fall of empires, seeking to identify the factors that allowed some leaders to achieve lasting greatness while others destroyed themselves through overreach or complacency. His essays on historical topics were brilliant but troubling to his instructors. Napoleon wrote admiringly of Caesar's dictatorship, defending it as necessary to save Rome from chaos. He praised Alexander's conquests while criticizing his failure to create lasting institutions. Most controversially, he questioned the divine right of kings, arguing that legitimate authority came from merit rather than birth. "Young Bonaparte possesses dangerous ideas," warned Father Berton, the school's head of moral instruction. "He questions everything, accepts nothing on faith, and seems to believe that existing institutions exist only until someone stronger comes along to replace them." These concerns were well-founded. Napoleon was indeed developing a worldview that would prove incompatible with the Bourbon monarchy he was supposedly being trained to serve. His years at Brienne coincided with the intellectual ferment that would eventually produce the French Revolution, and Napoleon absorbed the new ideas like a sponge absorbs water. He read Voltaire's criticisms of religious superstition and arbitrary government. He studied Rousseau's theories about the social contract and the general will. He followed the debates about colonial policy and economic reform that were beginning to shake the foundations of the old regime. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Napoleon didn't simply adopt these new ideas. He synthesized them with his own observations about power, leadership, and human nature. His social isolation at Brienne actually aided his intellectual development. While other students formed friendships based on shared backgrounds and common interests, Napoleon remained apart, observing his classmates with the detachment of a natural scientist studying specimens. He learned to read character, to identify strengths and weaknesses, and to understand how different personality types responded to various forms of pressure. "He watches us like a general studying an enemy army," complained one of his classmates. "Even when he's playing games, you can see him calculating odds and planning strategies." This observation was more accurate than the student realized. Napoleon was indeed treating every interaction as a learning opportunity, every game as a military exercise, every social situation as a laboratory for testing theories about human behavior. By the time he graduated from Brienne, he had developed an understanding of psychology that would serve him well in both military and political contexts. Napoleon's final year at Brienne was marked by growing confidence and emerging leadership qualities. Despite his social isolation, younger students began seeking his help with difficult subjects. Recognizing his superior knowledge and his willingness to explain complex concepts clearly, he organized study groups, coached struggling classmates in mathematics, and began displaying the charismatic authority that would later make him irresistible to soldiers and civilians alike. His graduation examination results were outstanding across the board, but it was his performance in military science that truly impressed the examining committee. Napoleon demonstrated not only comprehensive knowledge of tactics and strategy, but also an intuitive understanding of logistics, engineering, and the psychological factors that determine the outcome of battles. This young man possesses the finest military mind I have encountered in 30 years of instruction, declared General de Reynaud, the chief examiner. With proper guidance and experience, he could become one of France's great commanders. The prophecy would prove accurate, though the general had no way of knowing that Napoleon would achieve his greatness by overthrowing the very system of government that Brienne was designed to serve. In October 1784, 15-year-old Napoleon graduated from Brienne and prepared to enter the École Militaire in Paris, the most prestigious military academy in France. He was younger than most entering students, but his exceptional performance had earned him the right to skip the usual preparatory courses and enter directly into the advanced curriculum. As he packed his few possessions and prepared to leave Brienne forever, Napoleon reflected on the 5 years that had transformed him from a Corsican child into a French military cadet. The boy who had arrived speaking broken French was now more fluent than many native speakers. The outsider who had been mocked for his origins had proven himself superior to his aristocratic classmates in every subject that mattered. But perhaps, most importantly, the child who had begun his education, believing in the natural superiority of his social betters, had learned to judge men by their abilities rather than their birth. This lesson would prove crucial in the coming years, as France entered a period of revolutionary upheaval that would destroy the old order and create opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. Napoleon Bonaparte was ready for whatever challenges awaited him in Paris. He had been forged in the fires of academic competition and social rejection, tempered by intellectual rigor and personal discipline. The young man who left Brienne for the capital carried within him not only exceptional knowledge and skills, but also the burning ambition that would soon set Europe ablaze. The next phase of his education would take place not in a classroom, but in the crucible of revolution, where the theories he had mastered would be tested against the harsh realities of political and military conflict. Napoleon was ready for that test, confident in his abilities, and certain of his destiny. He had spent 5 years learning how the world worked. Now he was eager to begin the process of remaking it according to his own vision. The École Militaire in Paris was the pinnacle of French military education, designed to produce officers capable of leading the Royal Army to glory on the battlefields of Europe. When Napoleon Bonaparte arrived in October 1784, the institution was a monument to aristocratic privilege, where the sons of ancient houses learned the art of war while maintaining the social distinctions that defined the old regime. But Napoleon was arriving at a moment when the old regime itself was beginning to crack under pressures that would soon tear it apart entirely. The American Revolution had demonstrated that established powers could be defeated by determined colonists fighting for liberty. France's support for the American rebels had bankrupted the royal treasury, creating a fiscal crisis that would force King Louis XVI to summon the Estates General for the first time since 1614. Ideas about natural rights, popular sovereignty, and rational government were spreading through French society like fire through dry grass. Into this volatile atmosphere came a 16-year-old Corsican with a brilliant mind, boundless ambition, and no particular loyalty to the system he was supposedly being trained to defend. Napoleon's time at the École Militaire would last only 11 months, but those months would complete his transformation from provincial outsider to French patriot, and, more importantly, would give him the military knowledge he would need to ride the coming revolution to unprecedented heights of power. Napoleon's academic performance at the École Militaire was even more outstanding than it had been at Brienne. He completed the normal 2-year curriculum in 11 months, graduating 42nd out of 58 students, a respectable if not spectacular ranking that reflected the social prejudices of his instructors as much as his actual abilities. His mathematics and military science scores were among the highest in the school's history, but his marks in deportment and social graces were consistently poor. Cadet Bonaparte possesses exceptional intellectual gifts, wrote his commanding officer, but his Corsican origins and Republican sympathies make him unsuitable for service in fashionable regiments. He would be better suited to the artillery, where technical competence matters more than social polish. This assessment would prove prophetic. Napoleon was indeed assigned to the artillery, a branch of service that was considered less prestigious than the cavalry or infantry, but that offered unique opportunities for rapid advancement based on merit rather than birth. The artillery was the most technical branch of the military, requiring officers who could master complex mathematics, understand engineering principles, and coordinate the precise timing necessary for effective cannon fire. Napoleon embraced his assignment with characteristic enthusiasm. He studied ballistics with the intensity of a natural philosopher, learned to cast cannon and manufacture gunpowder, and developed an almost mystical understanding of how artillery could be used to break enemy lines and demoralize opposing forces. His fellow officers noted that he seemed to think of cannons not as weapons, but as extensions of his own will. "He speaks of his guns the way other men speak of their children," observed Captain Marmont, who would later become one of Napoleon's marshals. "Every cannon has a personality, every shot has a purpose, and every bombardment is a symphony conducted by a master musician." Napoleon's first posting was to the Régiment de la Fère at Valence, a sleepy garrison town in southeastern France, where life moved at the leisurely pace typical of peacetime military service. For most young officers, such assignments were opportunities to enjoy the social pleasures of provincial society while fulfilling their minimal professional obligations. For Napoleon, they were chances to continue his education in military science, while observing the political and social changes that were transforming France. He read voraciously during his time at Valence, not only military manuals and historical works, but also the political pamphlets that were beginning to circulate throughout France as the fiscal crisis deepened. He followed the debates about taxation, representation, and governmental reform with the intensity of a professional politician. Most importantly, he began to understand that the coming crisis would create opportunities for ambitious men willing to stake everything on their ability to master revolutionary conditions. His letters from this period reveal a young man whose thinking was evolving rapidly as he tried to understand the forces that were reshaping his world. Writing to his brother Joseph, Napoleon analysed the American Revolution with the perspective of a military professional and a political theorist. The Americans succeeded not because they were stronger than the British, but because they understood that modern war is as much about morale and public opinion as about tactics and strategy. Washington won by avoiding decisive battles until the British public grew tired of supporting an expensive war in a distant land. This is a lesson that European generals have not yet learned, but they will, probably the hard way. Napoleon's provincial postings also allowed him to observe French society from multiple perspectives. He spent time with aristocrats who still believed in the divine right of kings, bourgeois intellectuals who dreamed of rational government, and common soldiers who cared little about political theory but resented the privileges of their social superiors. This exposure to different viewpoints gave him insights into the complex dynamics that would drive the coming revolution. When the Estates General convened in May 1789, Napoleon was serving with his regiment at Auxonne, close enough to Paris to follow political developments but far enough away to maintain the detachment of an observer rather than a participant. He watched with fascination as the Third Estate transformed itself into the National Assembly, as the Bastille fell to popular uprising, and as the feudal system was abolished in a single dramatic night session. "Everything is changing," he wrote to his uncle in Corsica. "The old world is dying, and no one knows what will be born from its ashes. This is either the beginning of a golden age, or the start of chaos that will consume everything. Probably both." Napoleon's prediction would prove accurate. The French Revolution would indeed create unprecedented opportunities for talented individuals while unleashing forces of destruction that would devastate Europe for more than 2 decades. But in 1789, as he watched the early stages of revolutionary transformation, Napoleon was still an obscure artillery officer whose greatest concern was securing leave to return to Corsica and participate in the political changes occurring there. His request for extended leave was granted in September 1789, and Napoleon returned to his native island for the first time since his childhood departure for Brienne. What he found there would complete his education in the practical realities of revolutionary politics and give him his first taste of the combination of idealism and brutality that would characterize his entire career. Corsica, in 1789, was experiencing its own revolutionary ferment as the island's inhabitants debated whether to embrace the changes occurring in France or pursue an independent path. The man leading the independence movement was Pasquale Paoli, the legendary patriot who had fought against Genoese and French rule before being forced into exile in England. Paoli had returned to Corsica in 1790 as a hero of liberty, and his presence galvanized those who hoped the French Revolution might provide an opportunity for Corsican independence. Napoleon's family was divided about Paoli and the independence movement. His father, Charles, had died in 1785, leaving the family's political choices to his sons. Joseph, gentle and cautious, favoured accommodation with French authority. Napoleon, aggressive and ambitious, was initially attracted to Paoli's vision of Corsican independence. "This is our moment," Napoleon wrote to Joseph in late 1789. "If we act decisively, Corsica could become the Switzerland of the Mediterranean, independent, neutral, and prosperous. Paoli understands this, and he has the credibility to lead us to freedom." But Napoleon's enthusiasm for Corsican independence would not survive his first meeting with Paoli himself. The legendary patriot, now in his 60s, was indeed charismatic and intelligent, but he was also suspicious of young men who had been educated in France and who spoke of liberty in the language of Rousseau rather than in the dialect of Corsican tradition. Their confrontation was inevitable. Napoleon, confident in his abilities and certain of his ideas, expected to be welcomed as a valuable ally in the independence movement. Paoli, wary of French-educated intellectuals who might compromise his movement's purity, was skeptical of the ambitious young artillery officer, who seemed more interested in personal advancement than in Corsican tradition. "You smell of France," Paoli told Napoleon during their first private meeting. "Your thoughts are French thoughts. Your ambitions are French ambitions. How can I trust a man who has spent more years in French schools than in Corsican soil?" Napoleon's response revealed both his pride and his pragmatism. "I am Corsican by birth and French by education. That makes me stronger than men who are purely one or the other. I can speak to both worlds and serve as a bridge between them." But Paoli was not interested in bridges. He wanted total commitment to Corsican independence, and he correctly sensed that Napoleon's loyalty was ultimately to himself rather than to any cause larger than his own advancement. The break between them became inevitable when Napoleon began questioning Paoli's strategic decisions and suggesting alternative approaches that reflected his French military training. The final rupture came in 1793, when Paoli aligned himself with Britain against revolutionary France. Napoleon, by then committed to the French cause, denounced Paoli as a traitor and found himself branded as an enemy of Corsican independence. The Bonaparte family was forced to flee the island, leaving behind their property and their dreams of playing leading roles in Corsican politics. This experience of revolutionary politics on a small scale taught Napoleon crucial lessons that would serve him well on the larger stage of European affairs. He learned that personal loyalty was more important than ideological consistency, that successful leaders must be willing to break with former allies when circumstances demanded it, and that political movements were ultimately vehicles for individual ambition rather than expressions of abstract principles. Most importantly, his break with Paoli completed Napoleon's transformation from Corsican patriot to French revolutionary. He had burned his bridges to his homeland and committed himself fully to his adopted country. When he returned to France in 1793, he was no longer a Corsican serving in the French army, but a Frenchman whose destiny was tied completely to the success of the revolutionary cause. The young man who had left France as an artillery officer interested in Corsican independence returned as a fervent revolutionary, convinced that his future lay in serving the new order that was emerging from the chaos of revolutionary change. He was ready to stake everything on his ability to master the complex and dangerous game of revolutionary politics. The stage was set for Napoleon's meteoric rise to power. He had acquired the military knowledge necessary to excel in the technical demands of modern warfare. He had observed political revolution from multiple perspectives and learned to navigate its treacherous currents. Most importantly, he had developed the ruthless pragmatism that would allow him to succeed where more idealistic men would fail. All he needed now was an opportunity to demonstrate his abilities on a stage large enough to capture the attention of those who controlled the destiny of revolutionary France. That opportunity would come sooner than he expected, and when it arrived, Napoleon would be ready to seize it with both hands. As the flames crackle softly in our fireplace tonight, we continue Napoleon's extraordinary journey at the moment when a minor artillery officer would transform himself into the most celebrated general in Europe. The year 1793 found France surrounded by enemies, torn apart by internal strife, and desperate for leaders who could save the revolution from destruction. Into this chaos stepped Napoleon Bonaparte, armed with nothing but his cannons, his genius for war, and an ambition that would soon make him the master of kings. The boy from Corsica was about to become the architect of modern warfare, but first he would have to survive the terror, navigate the treacherous currents of revolutionary politics, and prove that merit could triumph over birth in the new world that was emerging from the blood-soaked ruins of the old regime. September 1793. Toulon, France's greatest naval base on the Mediterranean, had fallen to the enemies of the revolution. Royalist sympathisers within the city had opened the gates to a combined British, Spanish and Neapolitan fleet, creating a dagger pointed at the heart of revolutionary France. If Toulon remained in enemy hands, the counter-revolutionary forces would have a permanent foothold on French soil and a base from which to coordinate their efforts to destroy the Republic. The situation was desperate. French armies were fighting on multiple fronts against the First Coalition, a grand alliance of European monarchies determined to crush the revolution before its dangerous ideas could spread beyond France's borders. The loss of Toulon would give the enemies of France control of the Mediterranean and potentially allow them to link up with royalist forces in the rebellious provinces of the south. The revolutionary government in Paris had dispatched army after army to retake the fortress city, but each assault had failed with appalling casualties. The conventional tactics of the old regime, massed infantry charges against fortified positions, proved useless against defenders who held the high ground and possessed naval artillery support. France needed a new approach, and it needed a commander capable of thinking beyond the outdated military doctrines of the previous century. That commander would prove to be a 24-year-old artillery captain whose name was virtually unknown outside professional military circles. Napoleon Bonaparte had arrived at Toulon almost by accident, having been sent there to replace an artillery officer who had been wounded in one of the failed assaults. But accident or not, his arrival would mark the beginning of one of the most spectacular military careers in human history. Napoleon's first action upon reaching the siege lines was to conduct a personal reconnaissance of the enemy positions, riding close enough to the city walls to draw fire from British Marines. What he saw convinced him that every previous French attack had been fundamentally misconceived. The commanders had been trying to take Toulon by direct assault, but the city's fortifications made such an approach suicidal. "They are attacking the walls," Napoleon explained to his battery commanders, when they should be attacking the sea. His analysis was brilliant in its simplicity. Toulon's strength came not from its land fortifications, but from its access to the sea, which allowed the Allied fleet to supply the garrison indefinitely while providing heavy naval guns to support the defence. Cut off the city's connection to the sea, and the fortress would become a trap for its defenders, rather than an impregnable stronghold. Napoleon identified the key to victory, a promontory called l'Aiguillette that commanded the inner harbour. If French artillery could be positioned on this height, it could make the anchorage untenable for enemy ships and force the Allied fleet to withdraw. Without naval support, the garrison would be compelled to surrender or face annihilation. The plan was strategically sound, but executing it would require extraordinary tactical skill and personal courage. l'Aiguillette was heavily fortified and defended by seasoned British troops, who understood its strategic importance as well as Napoleon did. Taking it would require precise coordination between artillery, infantry, and engineering units, the kind of combined arms operation that French commanders had not yet mastered. Napoleon spent days preparing for the assault, positioning his guns with mathematical precision and coordinating with infantry commanders who initially doubted the young artillery officer's authority. His reputation for technical competence had preceded him, but many older officers questioned whether someone so young could possess the leadership qualities necessary to coordinate a complex military operation. Those doubts vanished during the preliminary bombardment that began Napoleon's assault on l'Aiguillette. His artillery fire was more accurate and effective than anything the siege had previously witnessed, systematically destroying enemy gun positions while avoiding damage to civilian areas of the city. French soldiers, who had grown accustomed to futile attacks and heavy casualties, began to believe that this young officer might actually succeed, where so many others had failed. "He shoots like the devil himself," one infantry colonel observed. "Every round finds its mark, and his timing is perfect. I have never seen artillery handled with such precision." The final assault on l'Aiguillette took place on December the 17th, 1793. during a winter storm that provided cover for the attacking French forces. Napoleon personally directed the artillery fire that suppressed the British defenders, then led his gunners in a desperate charge to secure the captured position before enemy reinforcements could arrive. During the fighting, Napoleon was wounded by a British pike thrust to his thigh, but he refused to leave the battlefield until L'Aiguillette was secure and his guns were in position to command the harbour. The wound would leave him with a permanent limp, but it also earned him the respect of the hardened veterans who had witnessed his courage under fire. The results of Napoleon's tactical innovation were immediate and decisive. His artillery fire from L'Aiguillette made the inner harbour untenable for Allied shipping, forcing the British fleet to withdraw to the outer roads where it could no longer effectively support the garrison. Cut off from reinforcement and resupply, the defenders of Toulon found their position hopeless. On December 19, 1793, the Allies evacuated Toulon, taking with them the French royalists who had collaborated in the city's occupation. The tricolour flag of the Republic once again flew over France's greatest Mediterranean fortress, and the immediate threat to the revolution's southern flank had been eliminated. Napoleon's role in the victory was recognised immediately by the political representatives who had been sent from Paris to oversee the siege. Paul Barras, who would later play a crucial role in Napoleon's rise to power, wrote to the Committee of Public Safety, "The capture of Toulon is due primarily to the scientific skill and audacious courage of citizen Bonaparte, who conceived the plan of attack and executed it with remarkable precision. This young officer possesses military talents of the highest order." On December the 22nd, 1793, Napoleon Bonaparte was promoted to Brigadier General, making him one of the youngest generals in French history. At 24, he had achieved a rank that most officers could not hope to reach before their 40s, and he had done it through demonstrated competence rather than political connections or social privilege. But Napoleon understood that his promotion was not just a reward for past service. It was an opportunity to prove himself on an even larger stage. The victory at Toulon had established his reputation as an artillery specialist of unusual ability, but true greatness would require him to master all aspects of military command while navigating the treacherous politics of revolutionary France. The young general who left Toulon in early 1794 was no longer the obscure artillery captain who had arrived there 4 months earlier. He had tasted victory on a significant scale, commanded the respect of veteran soldiers, and attracted the attention of the political leaders who controlled the destiny of the Republic. Most importantly, he had proven to himself that his theories about warfare could be translated into practical success on the battlefield. Napoleon Bonaparte had announced his arrival on the stage of European history with a demonstration of military genius that would echo across the continent for decades to come. The siege of Toulon was only the beginning of his legend, but it established the foundation upon which everything else would be built. The reputation of a commander who could win victories when victory seemed impossible. Napoleon's rapid promotion to general brought him into direct contact with the most radical foes of the French Revolution, the period known as the Terror, when revolutionary paranoia reached such heights that even the leaders of the revolution were consuming their own with systematic brutality. From 1793 to 1794, the guillotine became the primary instrument of French domestic policy, and survival depended as much on political skill as military competence. The Terror was orchestrated by Maximilien Robespierre, a lawyer from Arras whose cold intelligence and incorruptible virtue had made him the most feared man in France. Robespierre believed that the revolution could only succeed if it was purged of all enemies, internal and external, and he possessed both the conviction and the organizational skill necessary to implement systematic political murder on an unprecedented scale. For Napoleon, who had achieved prominence at exactly the moment when the Terror was reaching its peak, association with the radical revolutionaries was both essential for advancement and potentially fatal if political winds shifted. He needed their support to maintain his position and secure larger commands, but he also had to avoid becoming so closely identified with their policies that he would be destroyed if they fell from power. This delicate balancing act required all of Napoleon's political intelligence and personal charm. He had to demonstrate revolutionary fervour without becoming a fanatic, show loyalty to the regime without becoming personally dependent on any individual leader, and build a reputation based on professional competence rather than ideological purity. Napoleon's relationship with Augustin Robespierre, Maximilian's younger brother and a powerful figure in the revolutionary government, exemplified this complex political dance. Augustin was responsible for military affairs in southern France, which made him Napoleon's direct superior, but he was also a true believer in revolutionary ideology who suspected anyone whose commitment seemed primarily professional rather than personal. "You fight well for the Republic," Augustine told Napoleon during one of their meetings in early 1794. "But do you believe in the Republic, or do you simply see it as a vehicle for your own advancement?" Napoleon's response revealed the sophisticated political thinking he had developed during his years of observing revolutionary politics. "I believe in victory. When the Republic wins, France wins, and when France wins, liberty wins. My personal advancement serves the cause because it demonstrates that the revolution rewards merit rather than birth." This answer satisfied Augustine while avoiding any commitment to specific revolutionary policies that might become liabilities if circumstances changed. Napoleon was learning to speak the language of revolutionary politics while maintaining the flexibility necessary to adapt to changing conditions. His military assignments during this period reflected both his growing reputation and the regime's need to test his political reliability. Napoleon was given command of artillery forces along the Italian frontier, where he was expected to demonstrate both professional competence and revolutionary enthusiasm in operations against the armies of Piedmont and Austria. The Italian campaign of 1794 provided Napoleon with his first opportunity to command large-scale military operations and to implement the tactical innovations he had been developing since his days at the École Militaire. Working with limited resources and facing numerically superior enemies, he demonstrated the combination of strategic insight and tactical brilliance that would characterize all his future campaigns. His use of artillery in the Italian mountains was particularly innovative. Rather than employing cannons as static defensive weapons, Napoleon treated them as mobile instruments of offense that could be rapidly concentrated at decisive points to break enemy lines. His ability to move guns across difficult terrain and position them where enemies least expected artillery fire gave French forces advantages that often proved decisive in close-fought battles. "Bonaparte's cannons appear wherever we are weakest," complained an Austrian general after suffering a series of defeats. "He seems to understand terrain better than our own officers, and his guns strike with the precision of a master surgeon wielding a scalpel." But Napoleon's military successes during this period were overshadowed by the political crisis that was building in Paris. By the summer of 1794, even committed revolutionaries were growing weary of the terror's excesses, and Robespierre's increasingly paranoid behaviour was alienating former allies who feared they might be his next victims. The conspiracy that would destroy Robespierre was already forming when Napoleon received orders to report to Paris for reassignment to the Army of the West, which was fighting against royalist rebels in the Vendée. This transfer was presented as a promotion, but Napoleon recognized it as a potential trap. Service in the Civil War might force him to participate in atrocities that would damage his reputation, while failure to serve enthusiastically might result in accusations of insufficient revolutionary zeal. His response demonstrated the political sophistication that would serve him well throughout his career. Rather than refusing the assignment directly, which would have been tantamount to suicide, Napoleon feigned illness and requested medical leave, effectively removing himself from Paris during the crucial weeks when Robespierre's fate was being decided. This strategic absence proved to be one of the most important decisions of Napoleon's early career. On July 27, 1794, 9 Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar. Robespierre and his closest supporters were arrested, tried, and executed in a single day. The terror was over, but its end created new dangers for those who had been associated with a radical phase of the revolution. Napoleon's careful cultivation of multiple relationships and his avoidance of close identification with any particular faction allowed him to survive the Thermidorian reaction that followed Robespierre's fall. While many military commanders who had been closely associated with the terror were purged or marginalized, Napoleon's reputation for professional competence and political moderation made him valuable to the new regime. But survival was not the same as advancement, and Napoleon found his career temporarily stalled as the Directory government that replaced the terror sought to distance itself from the military adventurism that had characterized the radical period. For nearly 2 years, he would remain on half pay, technically attached to the army, but without significant command responsibilities. This period of enforced idleness was frustrating for someone of Napoleon's ambition, but it also provided him with opportunities to study, reflect, and plan for the future. He spent his time reading military history, developing new tactical concepts, and observing the political evolution of post-terror France. Most importantly, he began to cultivate relationships with civilian politicians who might prove useful when circumstances again favored military solutions to political problems. The young general, who had risen so rapidly during the terror, had learned valuable lessons about the relationship between military and political power in revolutionary France. Success required not just professional competence, but also political intelligence, personal flexibility, and the ability to survive periods when military virtues were less valued than civilian skills. Napoleon Bonaparte had demonstrated that he could win battles and inspire soldiers, but he had also proven that he could navigate the treacherous currents of revolutionary politics without losing either his life or his position. These skills would prove essential as France moved toward the next phase of its revolutionary evolution, a phase that would provide Napoleon with opportunities for advancement that even his boundless ambition had not yet imagined. Paris in 1795 was a city caught between revolutionary exhaustion and uncertain hope. The terror was over, but the Directory government that had replaced it struggled to establish legitimacy while managing the massive social and economic disruptions left by years of political upheaval. In this atmosphere of cautious recovery, Napoleon Bonaparte found himself in an unusual position, a proven military commander without a command, a rising star temporarily eclipsed by political circumstances beyond his control. It was during this period of professional uncertainty that Napoleon would encounter the woman who would become his first wife and the great passion of his early life. Joséphine de Beauharnais was everything Napoleon was not. Elegant where he was intense, sophisticated where he was provincial, experienced in the ways of Parisian society where he remained fundamentally an outsider despite his military achievements. Their meeting took place in the salon of Paul Barras, the Directory politician who had witnessed Napoleon's triumph at Toulon and who maintained contacts with military officers who might prove useful in the unstable political environment of post-revolutionary France. Barras's salon was one of the few places in Paris where successful revolutionaries, former aristocrats, and ambitious newcomers could mingle without the ideological suspicions that poison most social interactions. Joséphine had come to Barras's attention through her own remarkable survival skills. Born Marie-Joseph Rose de Tacher on the Caribbean island of Martinique, she had married into French aristocracy through her union with Alexandre de Beauharnais, a liberal nobleman who had initially supported the revolution before falling victim to the terror in 1794. His execution had left Joséphine a widow with 2 young children, forcing her to navigate post-revolutionary society with a combination of charm, intelligence, and carefully calculated relationships. At 32, Joséphine was 6 years older than Napoleon, but she possessed a mature sensuality and social sophistication that fascinated the young general. She had learned to survive in a world where political allegiances shifted overnight, and where personal relationships could mean the difference between prosperity and destitution. Her elegance was not the inherited grace of the old aristocracy, but the carefully cultivated poise of someone who had adapted to revolutionary circumstances without losing her essential femininity. Napoleon's attraction to Josephine was immediate and overwhelming. He had spent his youth focused entirely on military and political advancement, with little time or interest in romantic attachments. But Josephine represented everything he found fascinating about the sophisticated world he was trying to master: beauty, grace, and the kind of effortless social skills that his Corsican origins and military education had not provided. "She is like music made visible," Napoleon wrote to his brother Joseph after their first meeting. "When she speaks, it is with the voice of civilization itself, refined by centuries of culture and made perfect by natural intelligence. I understand now why men fight wars over women. She is worth any number of victories." This romantic hyperbole was characteristic of Napoleon's intense personality, but it also revealed his recognition that Josephine could provide him with access to social circles that remained closed to military officers of humble origins. Marriage to the widow of a revolutionary hero would strengthen his political position while satisfying his emotional needs and his social ambitions. Josephine's initial response to Napoleon's courtship was more calculating than passionate. She found him intellectually stimulating and professionally accomplished, but she was not immediately impressed by his physical appearance or social skills. Napoleon was still thin and somewhat awkward in civilian society. His intensity could be overwhelming in intimate settings, and his Corsican accent marked him as provincial despite his military achievements. But Josephine was too intelligent to dismiss Napoleon based on superficial considerations. She recognized his exceptional abilities and understood that his career was likely to trajectory upward as France continued to need military leadership. More immediately, she was attracted by his complete devotion to her and his willingness to subordinate his other interests to winning her affection. Their courtship was conducted against the background of Napoleon's growing frustration with his lack of military employment. The Directory government was pursuing a policy of avoiding foreign adventures while consolidating revolutionary gains at home, which meant that proven military commanders were seen as potentially dangerous rather than valuable assets. Napoleon spent months lobbying for significant command assignments, but his reputation for competence was balanced by concerns about his political reliability and personal ambition. Directory leaders remembered that successful generals had a tendency to become independent political actors, and they were determined to prevent any individual from accumulating enough military power to threaten civilian control of government. His temporary assignment to the Bureau of Topography, essentially a desk job involving map-making and route planning, was both an insult to his abilities and a reminder of his dependence on political favour for career advancement. Napoleon chafed at this bureaucratic exile, but he used the time to study European geography systematically and to develop the detailed knowledge of terrain that would later serve him well in campaign planning. The relationship with Josephine provided emotional compensation for professional frustrations. She introduced him to the cultural life of Paris, accompanying him to theatres and salons where he could observe the social and intellectual elite of post-revolutionary France. Through her connections, he met writers, artists, and scientists who expanded his understanding of subjects beyond military affairs. Most importantly, Josephine helped Napoleon develop the personal charm and social skills that would prove essential for political success. She taught him how to engage in the kind of casual conversation that oils social interaction, how to flatter without seeming obsequious, and how to project authority while remaining approachable. "You must learn to wear your greatness lightly," she told him during one of their private conversations. "Men will follow you into battle because you are competent, but they will love you only if you seem human. Your intensity is impressive, but it can also be frightening. Sometimes power is best exercised with a smile. This advice would prove invaluable throughout Napoleon's career. His ability to inspire personal loyalty from soldiers and civilians alike would depend not just on his professional abilities, but on his capacity to connect with people on an emotional level while maintaining the authority necessary for effective leadership. Napoleon and Josephine were married on March 9th, 1796, in a simple civil ceremony that reflected both the secular values of revolutionary France and the practical constraints of their circumstances. Neither possessed great wealth, and Napoleon's immediate career prospects remained uncertain despite his military reputation. But the wedding took place just as political circumstances were shifting in ways that would provide Napoleon with the opportunity he had been seeking. The Directory was coming under increasing pressure from both royalist opponents and radical republicans, and foreign military threats were making civilian leadership appear inadequate to the challenges facing France. Within weeks of his marriage, Napoleon would receive the appointment that would transform him from a frustrated staff officer into the most celebrated general in Europe. His new command would be the Army of Italy, and his mission would be to defeat the combined forces of Austria and Piedmont while securing revolutionary France's southern frontier. The young general who accepted this appointment was no longer the intense but socially awkward artillery officer who had achieved fame at Toulon. Marriage to Josephine had given him confidence in civilian settings, while providing him with the social connections necessary for political success. More importantly, his experience of love had revealed emotional depths that would allow him to inspire the kind of personal loyalty that transforms competent commanders into legendary leaders. Napoleon Bonaparte was ready for greatness, and greatness was about to call upon him to demonstrate that the theories he had mastered in school and the skills he had developed in minor campaigns could be applied successfully to the grand strategic challenges that would determine the fate of nations. March 1796. Napoleon Bonaparte, newly married and barely 27 years old, arrived at his headquarters in Nice to assume command of the Army of Italy. What he found there was less an army than a collection of demoralized units that had been fighting a defensive campaign against Austrian and Piedmontese forces for 3 years without achieving any significant success. The Army of Italy consisted of approximately 30,000 men, but they were poorly supplied, irregularly paid, and led by officers who had grown accustomed to accepting stalemate as the best possible outcome. The soldiers were competent enough, but their morale had been undermined by months of inconclusive fighting and the knowledge that they were considered a secondary theatre compared to the main armies operating along France's northern and eastern frontiers. Napoleon's first action upon taking command was to address his assembled officers, many of whom were older than he and resentful of being commanded by someone they considered a political appointee rather than a proven military leader. His speech was brief but memorable, revealing both his understanding of psychology and his confidence in his ability to transform the strategic situation. "Soldiers," he declared, "you are naked and ill-fed. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces and great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches. Soldiers of Italy, will you lack courage or constancy?" This address was significant not just for its promises, but for its strategic insight. Napoleon understood that the Army of Italy's greatest weakness was not tactical, but psychological. The soldiers had lost confidence in their ability to achieve decisive victory. By painting a vision of conquest and enrichment, he was appealing to both their patriotism and their self-interest, while positioning himself as the leader who could deliver the success they craved. But speeches alone would not transform military circumstances. Napoleon spent his first weeks in command, conducting detailed reconnaissance of enemy positions, while implementing the organizational reforms necessary to improve his army's effectiveness. His approach to these preparations revealed the systematic intelligence that would characterize all his campaigns. First, he reorganized the army's supply system, establishing regular distributions of food and equipment that had been sporadic under previous commanders. Well-fed soldiers fight better than hungry ones, and Napoleon understood that logistical efficiency was as important as tactical brilliance for maintaining morale during extended campaigns. Second, he promoted younger officers who demonstrated competence while removing older commanders, whose thinking remained trapped in the conventions of 18th century warfare. This systematic renewal of leadership created a command structure more capable of implementing the rapid, flexible tactics that Napoleon intended to employ. Third, he established new communication systems that allowed him to coordinate the movements of widely separated units with unprecedented precision. Napoleon's genius lay not just in tactical innovation, but in his ability to control complex operations through superior information flow and command coordination. Most importantly, Napoleon developed a strategic plan that would exploit the fundamental weakness of the Allied position in northern Italy. The Austrian and Piedmontese armies, though individually formidable, were operating as separate entities with different objectives and limited coordination. By moving rapidly between them and concentrating his forces at decisive points, Napoleon could achieve local superiority despite being outnumbered overall. This strategy of central position, attacking enemies separately before they could unite against him, would become Napoleon's signature tactical approach. It required extraordinary speed, precise timing, and the ability to inspire soldiers to march farther and fight harder than conventional military wisdom suggested was possible. The campaign began on April 12, 1796, when Napoleon launched simultaneous attacks against Austrian positions at Montenotte and Piedmontese forces near Sivas. Both assaults succeeded brilliantly, demonstrating to his own soldiers and to enemy commanders that the strategic situation in Italy had changed fundamentally with the arrival of the new French commander. The Battle of Montenotte was particularly significant because it established the tactical pattern that would characterize the entire campaign. Napoleon concentrated his artillery at the crucial point of attack, used his infantry to fix enemy attention, then struck with devastating force at the precise moment when enemy reserves were committed elsewhere. The result was not just victory, but the kind of decisive victory that destroys enemy morale while inspiring one's own forces. "He fights like lightning," observed General Beaulieu, the Austrian commander, after suffering his first defeat at Napoleon's hands. "His attacks come from unexpected directions with overwhelming force, and by the time we understand his intentions, the battle is already lost." This metaphor of lightning would prove apt for the entire Italian campaign. In less than 2 weeks, Napoleon had defeated 4 separate armies, captured numerous fortresses, and forced Piedmont to negotiate a separate peace that removed it from the war entirely. The strategic situation that had remained static for 3 years had been revolutionized by a few days of brilliant maneuvering. The psychological impact of these early victories was as important as their strategic consequences. Napoleon's soldiers, who had grown accustomed to defensive thinking, discovered that they were capable of achieving the kind of dramatic successes they had only read about in accounts of Alexander's conquests or Caesar's campaigns. Their confidence in their young commander became absolute, creating the foundation for the personal loyalty that would carry Napoleon through the challenges of the next 2 decades. But Napoleon understood that military success alone would not be sufficient to establish his position permanently. He needed to demonstrate political sophistication as well as tactical brilliance, showing the Directory government that he could advance French interests without creating unnecessary complications for civilian leadership. His management of occupied territories revealed remarkable maturity for someone with limited previous experience in civil administration. Rather than simply looting conquered cities, Napoleon established systematic procedures for extracting contributions that would support his army while maintaining enough local cooperation to prevent guerrilla warfare. He negotiated with local leaders, respected religious customs, and generally behaved more like a statesman than a conqueror. This political sophistication served multiple purposes. It ensured that his army remained well supplied without depending on uncertain support from Paris. It demonstrated to the Directory that he could be trusted with independent command without creating diplomatic disasters. Most importantly, it established his reputation as someone capable of governing as well as fighting, laying the groundwork for the political career that would ultimately eclipse his military achievements. The culmination of the first phase of the Italian campaign came with the siege of Mantua, the great Austrian fortress that controlled the routes between northern Italy and Austria proper. Capturing Mantua would effectively end Austrian influence in Italy and establish Napoleon as the dominant military figure in southern Europe. The siege would last for nearly 8 months, during which Napoleon would fight 4 major battles against Austrian armies, attempting to relieve the fortress. Each of these battles, Castiglione, Bassano, Arcole, and Rivoli, would add to his legend while demonstrating different aspects of his military genius. At Castiglione, he showed his mastery of defensive tactics, allowing the Austrians to attack his prepared positions before counter-attacking with devastating effect. At Bassano, he demonstrated his ability to conduct pursuit operations that prevented defeated enemies from reorganizing for further resistance. At Arcole, he personally led his troops across a narrow bridge under heavy fire, establishing the image of personal courage that would inspire soldiers throughout his career. At Rivoli, he achieved perhaps his most brilliant tactical victory, using terrain and timing to destroy an Austrian army that possessed numerical superiority. By February 1797, Mantua had fallen, and Austrian resistance in Italy had collapsed. Napoleon had transformed the strategic situation in southern Europe while establishing himself as the most successful general of his generation. The young man who had arrived in Italy as an unknown appointee had become the most famous soldier in France and one of the most celebrated military commanders in European history. But Napoleon's ambitions extended far beyond military fame. He understood that his Italian victories had given him political leverage that he could use to influence the course of the revolution itself. The boy from Corsica had become a force in European politics, and he was already beginning to contemplate the ultimate prize that would soon be within his grasp: power over France itself. The Italian campaign was ending, but Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to supreme authority was just beginning. The lightning that had struck Austria and Piedmont would soon illuminate all of Europe, and the young general who had mastered the art of war was preparing to master the even more complex art of ruling nations. As our fire burns lower tonight, we can see the outline of the future emperor taking shape in the mind of the successful general. Napoleon had learned that military victories could be translated into political power, that personal charisma could inspire loyalty beyond the battlefield, and that the right combination of talent, ambition, and opportunity could lift a man from obscurity to heights that even kings might envy. The next phase of his journey would take him from Italy to Egypt, from general to consul, from citizen to emperor. But the foundation for everything that followed had been laid in the fertile plains of northern Italy, where Napoleon Bonaparte first demonstrated that he possessed not just the ability to win battles, but the vision to reshape the world according to his own magnificent and terrible dreams. The fire crackles with mysterious intensity tonight, as if it holds secrets from the ancient sands of Egypt within its flames. We continue Napoleon's extraordinary journey at the moment when the conqueror of Italy would attempt his most audacious gamble, a campaign that would take him to the land of the pharaohs, where he would battle not just enemy armies, but the legends of antiquity itself. It was 1798, and Napoleon Bonaparte had achieved everything a general could hope for. He had defeated Austria, humbled Piedmont, and made himself the most celebrated military commander in Europe. But for a man whose ambition knew no bounds, past victories were merely stepping stones to greater glory. The East called to him, that mystical realm where Alexander had won immortal fame, and where new worlds waited to be conquered. As you settle deeper into comfort tonight, let the gentle flames transport you to the scorching deserts where Napoleon would discover that some dreams are too vast, even for the most powerful of mortals to grasp. Paris, early 1798. Napoleon paced the marble floors of his study like a caged lion, his mind churning with plans that would have seemed impossible to lesser men. The Directory government, alarmed by his popularity and growing political influence, was eager to find a mission that would remove him from France while serving the Republic's interests. For Napoleon, this presented an opportunity to achieve something unprecedented: the conquest of the East. The idea of an Egyptian expedition had been circulating among French intellectuals and military planners for decades. Egypt was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, but Turkish authority there was weak and corrupt. The country occupied a strategic position between Europe, Africa, and Asia, controlling the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean with the riches of India. More tantalizingly, Egypt was the land of ancient wonders, where French scholars could unlock the secrets of civilization itself, while French armies added new territories to the Republic. For Napoleon, Egypt represented the perfect fusion of his practical ambitions and romantic imagination. Here was a chance to emulate Alexander the Great by conquering the mysterious East, while simultaneously striking at British commercial interests and establishing France as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. If successful, an Egyptian campaign would make him not just a successful general, but a world historical figure whose achievements would echo through the ages. Egypt is the key to everything, Napoleon explained to his brother Joseph as they walked through the gardens of Malmaison, the elegant chateau that Josephine had purchased with the profits from Napoleon's Italian campaigns. Control Egypt, and you control the route to India. Control the route to India, and you can destroy British commerce. Destroy British commerce, and you have won the war for European supremacy. The strategic logic was compelling, but Napoleon's motivations went deeper than mere geopolitics. He had been reading voraciously about Egypt since his youth, the accounts of ancient historians, the reports of modern travelers, the speculations of Enlightenment philosophers about the origins of human civilization. Egypt was not just a country to be conquered, it was a mystery to be solved, a treasure house of knowledge waiting to be unlocked by French genius. The Directory approved Napoleon's Egyptian expedition with enthusiasm, though their motives were primarily domestic. The young general's popularity was becoming dangerous to civilian authority, and his obvious political ambitions made him a potential threat to the Republic's constitutional order. An Eastern campaign would satisfy his hunger for glory while removing him from France during the critical period when the Directory was consolidating its power. Let him conquer Egypt, one Directory member confided to another. If he succeeds, France gains an empire. If he fails, we are rid of a potential rival. Either outcome serves our interests. But Napoleon was too intelligent to be deceived about the Directory's motivations. He understood that he was being exiled as much as promoted, and he recognized that his political future would depend on achieving spectacular success in the East. Failure would mean not just military defeat, but political oblivion, while victory might provide him with the leverage necessary to return to France as its master rather than its servant. The preparation for the Egyptian expedition revealed Napoleon at his most impressive, a master organizer capable of coordinating vast enterprises while attending to the smallest details. The expedition would require not just military forces, but an entire traveling civilization capable of administering conquered territories while advancing human knowledge through scientific research. Napoleon assembled an army of approximately 40,000 men, carefully selected for their proven competence and their ability to adapt to unfamiliar conditions. But equally important was the civilian component of the expedition. Nearly 200 scholars, scientists, artists, and engineers who would study Egyptian antiquities, while the army secured French political control. This commission of sciences and arts was unprecedented in military history. Never before had a conquering army included mathematicians, archaeologists, linguists, botanists, and historians whose mission was to unlock the secrets of an ancient civilization. The expedition would be as much about expanding human knowledge as about extending French power. "We will bring the light of reason to a land that has been shrouded in darkness for centuries," Napoleon declared to the assembled scientists at their final briefing. "While our soldiers secure Egypt for France, you will secure Egypt for humanity. Your discoveries will outlive our conquests and ensure that this expedition is remembered not just for its military achievements, but for its contributions to human understanding." The romantic appeal of this mission attracted some of France's most brilliant minds. The mathematician Joseph Fourier, who would later develop the mathematical principles that bear his name, signed on as the expedition's scientific coordinator. The artist Dominique Vivant-Denon volunteered to document Egyptian monuments and artistic treasures. The engineer Nicolas Jacques Conté agreed to establish workshops capable of manufacturing everything from gunpowder to printing presses in the middle of the desert. But perhaps so significantly, Napoleon himself prepared for the expedition by immersing himself in Eastern history and culture. He studied Arabic, read the Quran, and familiarized himself with Islamic law and customs. Unlike most European conquerors, he intended to rule Egypt not as a foreign occupier, but as an enlightened despot who understood and respected local traditions. "I will be a second Muhammad," he confided to his secretary Bourrienne. "Like the Prophet, I will unite military conquest with religious authority, creating an empire based not just on force, but on the consent of the governed." This was an extraordinarily ambitious vision. The idea that a Corsican general could establish himself as a legitimate ruler in the Islamic world through a combination of military success and cultural sensitivity. It required not just tactical brilliance, but profound understanding of psychology, religion, and the complex dynamics of cultural exchange. On May 19, 1798, Napoleon's expedition departed from Toulon in a fleet of 400 ships carrying soldiers, scholars, and supplies sufficient for an extended campaign in hostile territory. The sight was magnificent, the largest French fleet assembled since the days of Louis XIV, carrying the hopes of the Republic and the ambitions of its most successful general toward a destination that remained shrouded in mystery and legend. As the French coast disappeared behind them, Napoleon stood on the deck of his flagship L'Orient, watching the Mediterranean stretch endlessly ahead. He was leaving behind everything familiar, his wife, his homeland, his established reputation, to pursue a dream that might elevate him to heights of glory previously achieved only by the greatest conquerors in history. "We are sailing toward destiny," he told his staff officers as they gathered around him on the ship's quarterdeck. "Either we will return as the masters of the East, or we will find our graves in Egyptian sand. There is no middle ground for men who attempt the impossible." The young general who spoke these words had no way of knowing that his Egyptian adventure would indeed prove impossible in the end, not because his army would lack courage or competence, but because the ancient land of the pharaohs would teach him lessons about the limits of human ambition that no European education could have provided. But for now, as the fleet sailed eastward under Mediterranean stars, Napoleon Bonaparte could still believe that his will was sufficient to overcome any obstacle, and that his genius could solve any problem. The man who had conquered Italy was about to attempt the conquest of legend itself. July 1st, 1798, the French fleet approached the Egyptian coast near Alexandria, and Napoleon's soldiers caught their first glimpse of the land they had come to conquer. What they saw was not the fertile paradise described in recruiting speeches, but a harsh landscape of sand and stone baked under a merciless sun. The reality of Egypt was about to collide with their romantic expectations, and the collision would prove transformative for everyone involved. Alexandria itself was a shadow of its ancient glory. The city that had once been the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world, home to the great library and lighthouse that were counted among the wonders of the ancient world, was now a modest Ottoman port of perhaps 8,000 inhabitants. The harbour was silted up, the famous monuments were ruins, and the population seemed listless under the oppressive weight of Turkish misgovernment. But Napoleon understood that Alexandria's strategic importance far exceeded its current appearance. The city controlled Egypt's access to the Mediterranean, and securing it would provide the French expedition with a secure base for future operations. While cutting off potential Ottoman reinforcements from Constantinople, the assault on Alexandria began before dawn on July 2nd, with French soldiers wading ashore through the surf, while Napoleon himself splashed through the waves alongside his men. This personal example of shared danger immediately endeared him to troops who were facing their first taste of combat in an alien environment. The city's Mameluke defenders, elite warrior slaves who had ruled Egypt for centuries under nominal Ottoman suzerainty, fought with impressive courage but were overwhelmed by French discipline and superior firepower. Within hours, the tricolour flag of the Republic was flying over Alexandria's ancient walls, and Napoleon had established his first foothold in the land of the pharaohs. His proclamation to the people of Alexandria revealed the sophisticated approach he intended to employ throughout the campaign. Rather than presenting himself as a Christian conqueror, come to subjugate Muslim subjects, Napoleon positioned himself as a liberator who respected Islam, while opposing the corruption and tyranny of the ruling Mamelukes. People of Egypt, his proclamation declared, "You will be told that I have come to destroy your religion. Do not believe it. Reply that I have come to restore your rights and punish the usurpers, and that I respect God, his prophet, and the Quran more than the Mamelukes do." This was an extraordinary statement for a European commander to make in 1798. By proclaiming his respect for Islam and positioning himself as a reformer rather than a conqueror, Napoleon was attempting something unprecedented: the creation of a French empire in the Islamic world, based on religious tolerance and administrative efficiency rather than mere military occupation. The march from Alexandria to Cairo provided Napoleon's army with their first real taste of Egyptian conditions, and the experience was sobering. The July heat was unlike anything most European soldiers had ever experienced, with temperatures reaching levels that made marching in full equipment a form of torture. Water was scarce, the food was unfamiliar, and the landscape seemed designed to break the spirit of anyone foolish enough to attempt its conquest. But Napoleon's genius for inspiring troops revealed itself even under these harsh conditions. He marched alongside his soldiers, shared their hardships, and maintained the kind of cheerful confidence that convinced them their sufferings were temporary inconveniences rather than insurmountable obstacles. "Soldiers," he told them during a rest halt near the village of Damanhur, "from the top of these pyramids 40 centuries look down upon you." The pyramids were still days away, but Napoleon's words captured both the romantic appeal of their mission and the historical significance of their presence in Egypt. The first major battle of the campaign came at Shubrakit, where Napoleon encountered a Mameluke army led by Murad Bey, one of the two strongmen who effectively ruled Egypt under Ottoman nominal authority. The Mamelukes were magnificent warriors, superbly mounted, expertly trained in individual combat, and absolutely fearless in battle. But they were also products of a medieval military tradition that had not adapted to the realities of modern warfare. Napoleon's tactical response to the Mameluke charge demonstrated his ability to adapt European military techniques to unfamiliar conditions. He formed his infantry into large squares with artillery at the corners, creating formations that were virtually impregnable to cavalry attacks while maintaining the mobility necessary for offensive operations. The Battle of Shubrakit was a complete French victory, but it also revealed the unique challenges of Egyptian warfare. The the Mamelukes were not a national army that could be defeated and forced to surrender. They were a warrior caste whose individual members would continue fighting as long as they lived. Victory would require not just winning battles, but fundamentally altering the political and social structure of Egyptian society. The approach to Cairo was through landscape that seemed designed to humble human ambition. The city appeared across the desert like a mirage, its minarets and domes shimmering in the heat, while the pyramids of Giza loomed mysteriously on the horizon. For Napoleon's soldiers, who had been raised on classical education and romantic literature, the sight was both thrilling and intimidating. Cairo in 1798 was one of the largest cities in the Islamic world, with a population approaching 300,000, and a commercial importance that extended from the Sudan to Syria. But it was also a city that seemed frozen in time, its medieval architecture and traditional customs unchanged for centuries. The collision between French revolutionary ideas and Islamic traditional culture would create tensions that would define the entire Egyptian campaign. Napoleon established his headquarters in the house of Mohammed Bey el-Elfi, one of the Mameluke leaders who had fled the city before the French arrival. The building was a masterpiece of Islamic architecture, with cool courtyards, intricate geometric decorations, and the kind of sophisticated engineering that reminded the French that they were in a land with its own rich cultural traditions. His first priority was establishing effective administration of the conquered territory. Unlike his Italian campaigns, where he had been able to work through existing governmental structures, Egypt required the creation of entirely new institutions, capable of governing a population whose language, religion, and customs were completely unfamiliar to European administrators. The solution Napoleon developed was characteristically innovative. He established a system of joint administration that combined French efficiency with Islamic legitimacy. Egyptian notables were appointed to advisory councils that worked alongside French military governors, while traditional Islamic law continued to govern matters of personal status and religious observance. This approach required Napoleon to master not just military and political challenges, but cultural and religious complexities that would have defeated less intelligent commanders. He studied Islamic law, learned enough Arabic to communicate directly with Egyptian leaders, and demonstrated a genuine respect for Islamic culture that won him support from many Egyptians who had initially viewed the French as infidel invaders. But Napoleon's most significant achievement during the early months of the Egyptian campaign was his ability to maintain the morale and effectiveness of his army despite the harsh conditions and unfamiliar environment. European soldiers who had never experienced desert warfare learned to adapt their tactics to Egyptian conditions while maintaining the discipline and esprit de corps that made them formidable opponents. The scholarly component of the expedition was also beginning to produce remarkable results. French scientists and artists were documenting Egyptian monuments with unprecedented precision, making discoveries that would revolutionize European understanding of ancient history and culture. The work they were doing in Egyptian tombs and temples would eventually produce the monumental Description de l'Egypte, one of the greatest achievements of Enlightenment scholarship. By late 1798, Napoleon had achieved most of his immediate objectives. French forces controlled Lower Egypt from Alexandria to Cairo. The Mameluke military power had been broken, and a new administrative system was beginning to function effectively. The expedition that had seemed impossibly ambitious when it departed from Toulon was proving that French genius could indeed master the mysteries of the East. But success in Egypt was creating new problems that Napoleon had not anticipated. His triumph was inspiring other European powers to form new coalitions against France, while his extended absence from Europe was allowing rivals to challenge his political position at home. Most dangerously, British naval power in the Mediterranean was beginning to threaten the supply lines that connected Napoleon's army to France. The young general, who had dreamed of equaling Alexander's conquests, was about to learn that some achievements come at prices that even the most successful commanders cannot afford to pay. The land of wonders was indeed full of marvels, but it was also a trap from which escape would prove far more difficult than conquest had been. July 21st, 1798. The sun rose over the Giza plateau like a bronze shield, casting long shadows from the ancient pyramids across the desert, where two armies prepared for a battle that would determine the fate of Egypt. On one side stood Napoleon's Army of the Orient, 25,000 French soldiers who had marched across the desert to confront the legendary warriors of the East. On the other side waited the Mameluke army of Ibrahim Bey and Murad Bey, 6,000 of the finest cavalry in the world, supported by Ottoman infantry and Bedouin auxiliaries. The stage was set for a confrontation that would pit the military innovations of revolutionary Europe against the martial traditions of medieval Islam. For Napoleon, this battle would be the ultimate test of whether European tactics could triumph in the land where military history itself was born. For the Mamelukes, it would be a fight for the survival of a way of life that had dominated Egypt for over 5 centuries. Napoleon had positioned his army with the Nile at his back and the pyramids to his left, creating a battlefield where his soldiers would fight with the weight of history pressing down upon them. His dispositions revealed the tactical genius that had brought him victory in Italy. 5 infantry divisions arranged in massive squares with artillery positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, while his cavalry remained in reserve to exploit any opportunities that might develop. "Soldiers," Napoleon addressed his army as the morning light revealed the approaching Mameluke host. "From the summit of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you. Let your conduct today be such that posterity will speak of this battle with the same reverence they accord to the victories of Alexander and Caesar." The speech was vintage Napoleon, inspiring his troops by connecting their immediate situation to the grand sweep of history while reminding them that they were participating in events that would be remembered for millennia. But it was also psychologically astute, transforming what might have seemed like an isolated skirmish in a distant land into a moment of world historical significance. The Mameluke army was a spectacular sight as it advanced across the desert. Each warrior was a master horseman armed with carbine, pistols, saber, and dagger, wearing chainmail beneath flowing robes and mounted on horses bred for speed and endurance. They had ruled Egypt through personal courage and superior martial skill, and their confidence in their ability to defeat any enemy was absolute. Murad Bey, the Mameluke commander, had perhaps 60,000 gold pieces sewn into his garments as a symbol of his wealth and status. His warriors carried similar fortunes in weapons, jewelry, and precious metals, making them not just formidable enemies, but potentially lucrative victims. The sight of such wealth advancing toward French lines certainly did not diminish Napoleon's soldiers' motivation to win the coming battle. The initial Mameluke attack was as magnificent as it was futile. Several thousand horsemen charged directly at the French squares, their war cries echoing across the desert as they rode with the kind of individual heroism that had made them legends throughout the Islamic world. But individual heroism, however magnificent, was no match for disciplined firepower and coordinated tactics. Napoleon's infantry held their fire until the Mameluke cavalry was at point-blank range, then delivered volleys that were devastating in their effect. Horses and riders fell in windows before the French squares, while artillery fire from the corners of each formation created additional carnage among the tightly packed attackers. The Mamelukes regrouped and charged again, and then again, displaying courage that impressed even their enemies. But each attack was weaker than the last, as casualties mounted and the survivors began to recognize the futility of their traditional tactics against European firepower. "They fight like lions," observed General Desailly, commanding one of Napoleon's divisions. "But lions cannot stand against mathematics. Our squares are geometric perfection, and geometry always defeats individual courage. Napoleon himself remained calm throughout the battle, moving between his divisions to ensure coordination while observing enemy movements with the detachment of a natural philosopher studying interesting specimens. His confidence in the outcome was complete from the moment the battle began, not through arrogance, but through understanding of the tactical realities that made French victory inevitable. The turning point came when Napoleon launched a limited counterattack designed to break Mameluke morale, rather than simply inflict casualties. French infantry advanced from their squares in column formation, supported by artillery fire, pushing back Mameluke forces that had been weakened by repeated failed charges. The psychological impact of this advance was devastating for the Mamelukes, who had never experienced battlefield defeat at the hands of European forces. Their entire social and political system was based on military superiority, and the recognition that their traditional tactics were useless against French methods shattered their confidence as completely as French firepower had shattered their ranks. The battle ended with a general Mameluke retreat toward Upper Egypt, leaving behind not just their dead and wounded, but also immense quantities of treasure that had been intended to fund continued resistance. Napoleon's soldiers, who had been promised wealth during their march across the desert, found themselves able to collect enough gold and precious objects to make every man in the army temporarily wealthy. But the material gains from the Battle of the Pyramids were less significant than its strategic and psychological consequences. Napoleon had demonstrated conclusively that European military methods could triumph in Egypt, establishing French dominance over Lower Egypt while destroying Mameluke credibility as an effective fighting force. More importantly, the victory established Napoleon's reputation among Egyptians as a military genius whose success proved that his cause enjoyed divine favor. In a culture where military prowess was seen as evidence of God's blessing, Napoleon's triumph at the pyramids gave him a legitimacy that no amount of political propaganda could have achieved. The aftermath of the battle also revealed Napoleon's growing sophistication as a ruler, rather than merely a conqueror. Rather than pursuing the fleeing Mamelukes with the intention of exterminating them, he offered amnesty to those willing to serve French interests, while allowing others to retreat into Upper Egypt, where they could cause minimal trouble. This moderation was not motivated by sentiment, but by practical recognition that Egypt could not be governed effectively without the cooperation of at least some traditional elites. The Mamelukes possessed knowledge of local conditions, established relationships with tribal leaders, and administrative experience that would be valuable for French rule. Napoleon's treatment of the civilian population after the battle was equally sophisticated. Rather than allowing his soldiers to pillage Cairo as victorious armies traditionally did, he maintained strict discipline while establishing new institutions designed to demonstrate that French rule would be more just and efficient than Mameluke administration had been. The scholars who had accompanied the expedition were given free rein to begin their systematic study of Egyptian antiquities, with Napoleon himself participating in their investigations when military duties permitted. The future emperor was genuinely fascinated by the monuments they were uncovering, seeing in them evidence of the kind of lasting achievement he hoped to accomplish through his own conquests. These pyramids have survived for 4,000 years, he mused while examining the Great Pyramid after the battle. Long after our bones have turned to dust, travelers will still come here to wonder at what human ambition can accomplish when it is guided by genius and unlimited by conventional thinking. But even as Napoleon was savoring his triumph and contemplating the historical significance of his achievement, events beyond his control were conspiring to transform victory into potential disaster. British naval forces under Admiral Nelson were searching the Mediterranean for the French fleet, and when they found it, the consequences would threaten everything Napoleon had accomplished in Egypt. The Battle of the Pyramids had made Napoleon the master of Egypt, but mastery of Egypt would prove meaningless if he could not maintain communication with France. The young general, who had dreamed of equaling Alexander's achievements, was about to learn that some conquests create more problems than they solve, and that even the most brilliant victories can become the foundations of ultimate defeat.